Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a topic that has shaped global politics, military strategy, and international relations over the last few years. Vladimir Putin's biggest miscalculations and why they've led Russia into deeper challenges than ever before. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about understanding how decisions at the highest levels can reshape entire nations, disrupt global stability, and create long-term consequences that even powerful leaders may not fully anticipate. From strategic errors on the battlefield to economic misjudgments, diplomatic setbacks, and internal strains, Putin has faced an escalating series of unintended outcomes, many of which have made Russia's position more precarious than at any other time in his decades in power. In this video-style script, we'll explore these issues with clear reasoning, short paragraphs, and an easy-to-follow flow. So let's break it down step by step. Putin entered the Ukraine conflict under the belief that it would be a swift and decisive operation. This was one of the most significant miscalculations. The expectation that Ukrainian resistance would crumble quickly turned out to be completely wrong. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine mobilized with extraordinary unity, supported by widespread public resistance and rapid international assistance. Putin's circle reportedly believed that Ukraine's government lacked legitimacy and public loyalty, but reality proved the opposite. Ukrainians were far more prepared, far more motivated, and far more resilient than anticipated. This initial misjudgment had cascading consequences. What Putin expected to be a short military operation has dragged into a prolonged and costly conflict, stretching Russian resources and revealing weaknesses in training, logistics, and coordination. Russia's military, once portrayed as modernized and formidable, has been forced to confront problems that had been masked by years of internal corruption and inflated reporting. Another major miscalculation was underestimating the strength and unity of Western alliances. Putin likely believed that NATO and the European Union were divided, bogged down by internal disagreements, and too economically dependent on Russian energy to respond strongly. Instead, the invasion triggered one of the fastest and most unified Western responses in decades. Sanctions were implemented with unprecedented coordination. Military aid flowed rapidly to Ukraine. Nations that historically avoided deep involvement in conflicts began taking decisive stances. In short, Putin's actions revitalized the very alliances he sought to weaken. This miscalculation extended beyond military support. Economically, Russia expected that sanctions would be painful but manageable. Domestic propaganda painted the West as fragile and overly dependent on Russian commodities, but the global response proved more adaptable than the Kremlin anticipated. Europe diversified its energy sources far more quickly than expected. International companies pulled out of Russia in waves, shrinking investments and intellectual resources that once helped fuel the country's industries. Another unintended consequence was the long-term damage to Russia's energy leverage. For decades, Russia used its oil and gas exports as a powerful geopolitical tool. But the conflict forced Russia to redirect supplies at discounted rates to fewer buyers. This shift weakened Russia's bargaining power and reduced profits, undermining one of the country's most important sources of state revenue. Domestically, Putin also miscalculated the impact of mobilization and the long-term strain of war on Russian society. The Kremlin initially avoided large-scale conscription, assuming that volunteer forces, private military groups, and regional recruitment might be enough. But as the conflict dragged on, the demand for manpower increased sharply. When mobilization was announced, hundreds of thousands of Russians fled abroad, unwilling to participate in a conflict they felt unprepared for or ideologically opposed to. This exodus represented a significant loss of labor, talent, and economic potential. Another internal miscalculation was the belief that the Russian public would remain indefinitely passive or fully supportive. While many Russians do support the state narrative, fatigue has grown. Economic pressure, ongoing losses, and prolonged uncertainty have affected public sentiment. Even in an environment where dissent is heavily restricted, signs of frustration have appeared, subtle but meaningful. Putin anticipated unwavering stability. Instead, he has had to navigate rising internal pressures. On the global stage, Putin's diplomatic missteps have been just as significant as the military and economic ones. Before the conflict, Russia maintained a number of strategic partnerships, balancing relationships with China, India, Central Asian states, and parts of the Middle East. But as the conflict intensified, Russia found itself increasingly isolated. Many allies adopted cautious neutrality rather than explicit support. Partnerships that once appeared solid became transactional. Some nations began using Russia's weakened position to negotiate more favorable terms, taking advantage of its limited options. China, in particular, has gained more leverage over Russia. While the two countries share strategic interests, Russia's increasing dependency has shifted the balance of power. Instead of standing as equal partners, Russia has become more reliant on Chinese markets, technology, and diplomatic cover. This wasn't part of Putin's original vision for Russian strength on the world stage, but it has become a consequence of restricted global avenues. Another miscalculation was the belief that Russia could maintain technological independence or quickly replace lost Western components. For years, the Russian economy depended on imported microchips, machinery, software, and specialized industrial equipment. When sanctions cut off these supply chains, Russia struggled to replace them. While some imports were substituted through parallel markets, the replacements were often lower quality, more expensive, or less reliable. This has affected industries like aviation, manufacturing, and advanced weapons production. The technological gap widened. Modern warfare depends on precision, data, communications, and electronics. Without access to certain high-end components, the Russian military faced limitations that became more evident as the conflict continued. This was another example of how initial assumptions like the belief that Russia could easily circumvent sanctions proved inaccurate. One of Putin's most symbolic miscalculations was the assumption that the invasion would strengthen Russia's influence in its near abroad. Instead, neighboring countries grew more cautious, more defensive, and more aligned with Western partnerships. Finland and Sweden, historically non-aligned, moved toward NATO membership. This was the opposite of Russia's goal. Rather than weakening NATO, the conflict expanded it. In Eastern Europe, Russia's influence decreased. Countries that were once more neutral or balanced began increasing military spending, upgrading infrastructure, and reducing dependency on Russian energy. These shifts are long-term and strategic, reshaping the regional map in ways that diminish Russia's reach. Another major miscalculation was the impact on Russia's long-term demographic and economic stability. War accelerates population decline, especially when younger citizens leave the country or are lost in battle. Russia already faced demographic challenges before the conflict. The war has amplified them. A shrinking workforce, reduced foreign investment, and persistent sanctions create pressures that will shape the country for decades. Putin also misjudged the morale and cohesion of his own military structure. The conflict revealed deep divisions between different branches, commanders, and private military groups. The world witnessed public disputes, shifting leadership roles, and internal clashes that exposed weaknesses rarely seen in large, centralized militaries. These fractures undermined Russia's ability to operate effectively and maintain strategic clarity. Another miscalculation was the belief that information control would guarantee narrative dominance. While the Kremlin maintains strict media control domestically, the global information space is far more open and competitive. International reporting, satellite imagery, independent investigations, and digital communication made it difficult for Russia to control global perceptions. Information warfare did not unfold as Russia expected. Instead of shaping the narrative, Russia often found itself reacting to external exposure. And then there's the biggest long-term miscalculation of all, assuming the conflict would reinforce Russia's status as a global power. Instead, the prolonged war has exhausted resources, limited opportunities, and weakened the country's geopolitical position. Rather than projecting strength, the conflict has highlighted vulnerabilities. Rather than restoring influence, it has isolated the nation further. But even with these miscalculations, it's important to understand the broader picture. Russia remains a major power with significant military capabilities, vast natural resources, and a long strategic history. The country is not collapsing. It's not disappearing, but it is facing consequences that were not intended and not planned for. These consequences compound over time, creating a more challenging and uncertain future. Putin's leadership has been defined by centralized control, strict loyalty, and an insulated decision-making circle. In such systems, miscalculations can be amplified because dissenting voices are minimized. The lack of transparent information, competitive debate, or open criticism can lead to assumptions that go unchallenged. This environment likely played a key role in the errors that unfolded. What's happening now is a complex combination of military, economic, diplomatic, and societal factors. Some challenges will be temporary, while others will shape the future of Russia for decades. The world is witnessing a turning point in modern geopolitics, one that reveals how even powerful leaders can face consequences when strategic assumptions meet unexpected realities. As we reflect on these miscalculations, it becomes clear that this conflict will be studied for generations. Analysts, historians, and strategists will examine how decisions were made, how wrong assumptions led to wrong outcomes, and how the global order shifted as a result. It serves as a reminder that power doesn't guarantee accuracy, and confidence doesn't guarantee success. Understanding these missteps isn't about taking sides. It's about recognizing the complexity of international relations and the high cost of strategic errors. Leaders who misjudge political climates, underestimate opponents, or overestimate their capabilities risk creating crises that extend far beyond borders. The situation we're discussing today is a stark illustration of that reality. As the conflict continues, the long-term consequences will keep unfolding. Russia must navigate its internal pressures, economic constraints, and shifting alliances. The path forward will not be simple, and rebuilding stability internally and externally will require strategic adjustments that differ from the assumptions that led to the current situation. By examining these miscalculations, we gain insight into how global events can pivot unexpectedly. We understand how decisions at the highest levels of government shape everyday lives across nations, and we recognize the importance of critical thinking, accurate information, and informed leadership in preventing conflicts from spiraling into prolonged crises. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This has been a deep dive into one of the most significant geopolitical topics of our time. Stay informed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.